I'm Quincy Howe of ABC News, saying good evening from New York, where the two major candidates for President of the United States are about to engage in their fourth radio-television discussion of the present campaign. Tonight, these men will confine that discussion to foreign policy. Good evening, Vice President Nixon.
Good evening, Mr. Howe.
And good evening, Senator Kennedy.
Good evening, Mr. Howe.
Now let me read the rules and conditions under which the candidates themselves have agreed to proceed. As they did in their first meeting, both men will make opening statements of about 8 minutes each and closing statements of equal time, running 3 to 5 minutes each. During the half hour between the opening and closing statements, the candidates will answer and comment upon questions from a panel of 4 correspondents chosen by the nationwide networks that carry the program. Each candidate will be questioned in turn with opportunity for comment by the other. Each answer will be limited to 2 1/2 minutes, each comment to 1 1/2 minutes. The correspondents are free to ask any questions they choose in the field of foreign affairs. Neither candidate knows what questions will be asked. Time alone will determine the final question. Reversing the order in their first meeting, Senator Kennedy will make the second opening statement and the first closing statement. For the first opening statement, here is Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Howe, Senator Kennedy, my fellow Americans. Since this campaign began, I have had a very rare privilege. I have traveled to 48 of the 50 states. And in my travels, I have learned what the people of the United States are thinking about. There is one issue that stands out above all the rest, one in which every American is concerned, regardless of what group he may be a member and regardless of where he may live. And that issue, very simply stated, is this: how can we keep the peace, keep it without surrender? How can we extend freedom, extend it without war? Now, in determining how we deal with this issue, we must find the answer to a very important but simple question. Who threatens the peace? Who threatens freedom in the world? There's only one threat to peace and one threat to freedom, that is presented by the international communist movement. And therefore, if we are to have peace, if we are to keep our own freedom and extend it to others without war, we must know how to deal with the communists and their leaders. I know Mr. Khrushchev. I also have had the opportunity of knowing and meeting other communist leaders in the world. I believe there are certain principles we must find in dealing with him and his colleagues. Principles, if followed, that will keep the peace and that also can extend freedom. First, we have to learn from the past, because we cannot afford to make the mistakes of the past. In the 7 years before this administration came into power in Washington, we found that 600 million people went behind the Iron Curtain. And at the end of that 7 years, we were engaged in a war in Korea, which cost over 30,000 American lives. In the past 7 years, in President Eisenhower's administration, this situation has been reversed. We ended the Korean War. By strong, firm leadership, we have kept out of other wars, and we have avoided surrender of principle or territory at the conference table. Now, why were we successful as our predecessors were not successful? I think there are several reasons. In the first place, they made a fatal error in misjudging the communists, in trying to apply to them the same rules of conduct that you would apply to the leaders of the free world. One of the major errors they made was the one that led to the Korean War. In ruling out the defense of Korea, they invited aggression in that area. They thought they were going to have peace. It brought war. We learned from their mistakes. And so in our 7 years, we find that we have been firm in our diplomacy. We have never made concessions without getting concessions in return. We have always been willing to go the extra mile to negotiate for disarmament or in any other area. But we have never been willing to do anything that, in effect, surrendered freedom any place in the world. That is why President Eisenhower was correct in not apologizing or expressing regrets to Mr. Khrushchev at the Paris conference, as Senator Kennedy suggested he could have done. That is why President Eisenhower was also correct in his policy in the Formosa Straits, where he declined and refused to follow the recommendations which Senator Kennedy voted for in 1955, again made in 1959, again repeated in his debates that you have heard, recommendations with regard to, again, slicing off a piece of free territory and abandoning it, if in effect, to the communists. Why did the president feel this was wrong, and why was the president right and his critics wrong? Because, again, this showed a lack of understanding of dictators, a lack of understanding particularly of communists, because every time you make such a concession, it does not lead to peace. It only encourages them to blackmail you. It encourages them to begin a war. And so I say that the record shows that we know how to keep the peace, to keep it without surrender. Let us move now to the future. It is not enough to stand on this record, because we are dealing with the most ruthless, fanatical leaders that the world has ever seen. That is why I say that in this period of the 60s, America must move forward in every area. First of all, although we are today, as Senator Kennedy has admitted, the strongest nation in the world militarily, we must increase our strength. Increase it so that we will always have enough strength that regardless of what our potential opponents have, if they should launch a surprise attack, we will be able to destroy their war-making capability. They must know, in other words, that it is national suicide if they begin anything. We need this kind of strength because we're the guardians of the peace. In addition to military strength, we need to see that the economy of this country continues to grow. It has grown in the past 7 years. It can and will grow even more in the next 4. And the reason that it must grow even more is because we have things to do at home, and also because we are in a race for survival, a race in which it isn't enough to be ahead. It isn't enough simply to be complacent. We have to move ahead in order to stay ahead. And that is why in this field I have made recommendations which I am confident will move the American economy ahead. Move it firmly and soundly so that there will never be a time when the Soviet Union will be able to challenge our superiority in this field. And so we need military strength, we need economic strength, we also need the right diplomatic policies. What are they? Again, we turn to the past. Firmness, but no belligerence. And by no belligerence, I mean that we do not answer insult by insult. When you are proud and confident of your strength, you do not get down to the level of Mr. Khrushchev and his colleagues. And that example that President Eisenhower has set, we will continue to follow. But all this, by itself, is not enough. It is not enough for us simply to be the strongest nation militarily, the strongest economically, and also to have firm diplomacy. We must have a great goal, and that is not just to keep freedom for ourselves, but to extend it to all the world. To extend it to all the world because that is America's destiny. To extend it to all the world because the communist aim is not to hold their own, but to extend communism. And you cannot fight a victory for communism or a strategy of victory for communism with a strategy simply of holding the line. And so I say that we believe that our policies of military strength, of economic strength, of diplomatic firmness, first will keep the peace and keep it without surrender. We also believe that in the great field of ideals, that we can lead America to the victory for freedom, victory in the newly developing countries, victory also in the captive countries, provided we have faith in ourselves and faith in our principles.
Now the opening statement of Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Howe, Mr. Vice President. First, let me again try to correct the record on the matter of Kimoy and Matsu. I voted for the Formosa Resolution in 1955. I have sustained it since then. I've said that I agree with the administration policy. Mr. Nixon earlier indicated that he would defend Quemoy and Matsu, even if the attack on these islands, 2 miles off the coast of China, were not part of a general attack on Formosa and the Pescadores. I indicated that I would defend those islands if the attack were directed against Pescadores and Formosa, which is part of the Eisenhower policy. I've supported that policy. In the last week, as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I have reread the testimony of General Twining, representing the administration in 1959, and the Assistant Secretary of State before the Foreign Relations Committee in 1958, and I have accurately described the administration policy, and I support it wholeheartedly. So that really isn't an issue in this campaign. It isn't an issue with Mr. Nixon, who now says that he also supports the Eisenhower policy. Nor is the question that all Americans want peace and security an issue in this campaign. The question is, are we moving in the direction of peace and security? Is our relative strength growing? Is, as Mr. Nixon says, our prestige at an all-time high, as he said a week ago, and that of the communists at an all-time low? I don't believe it is. I don't believe that our relative strength is increasing. And I say that not as the Democratic standard bearer, but as a citizen of the United States who is concerned about the United States. I look at Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of the United States. In 1957, I was in Havana. I talked to the American ambassador there. He said that he was the second most powerful man in Cuba. And yet, even though Ambassador Smith and Ambassador Gardner, both Republican ambassadors, both warned of Castro, the Marxist influences around Castro, the communist influences around Castro, both of them have testified in the last 6 weeks that in spite of their warnings to the American government, nothing was done. Our security depends upon Latin America. Can any American looking at the situation in Latin America feel contented with what's happening today? When a candidate for the presidency of Brazil feels it necessary to call not on Washington during the campaign, but on Castro in Havana in order to pick up the support of the Castro supporters in Brazil. At the American conference, Inter-American conference this summer, when we wanted them to join together in the denunciation of Castro and the Cuban communists, we couldn't even get the Inter-American group to join together in denouncing Castro. It was rather a vague statement that they finally made. Do you know today that the Russians broadcast 10 times as many programs in Spanish to Latin America as we do? Do you know we don't have a single program sponsored by our government to Cuba to tell them our story, to tell them that we are their friends, that we want them to be free again? Africa is now the emerging area of the world. It contains 25% of all the members of the General Assembly. We didn't even have a Bureau of African Affairs until 1957. In the Africa south of the Sahara, which is the major new section, we have less students from all of Africa in that area studying under government auspices today than from the country of Thailand. If there's one thing Africa needs, it's technical assistance. And yet last year we gave them less than 5% of all the technical assistance funds that we distributed around the world. We relied in the Middle East on the Baghdad Pact. And yet when the Iraqi government was changed, the Baghdad Pact broke down. We relied on the Eisenhower Doctrine for the Middle East, which passed the Senate. There isn't one country in the Middle East that now endorses the Eisenhower Doctrine. We look to Asia, because the struggle is in the underdeveloped world. Which system, communism or freedom, will triumph in the next 5 or 10 years? That's what should concern us. Not the history of 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, but are we doing enough in these areas? What are freedom's chances in those areas? By 1965 or 1970, will there be other Cubas in Latin America? Will Guinea and Ghana, which have now voted with the communists frequently as newly independent countries of Africa, will there be others? Will the Congo go communist? Will other countries? Are we doing enough in that area? And what about Asia? Is India going to win the economic struggle, or is China going to win it? Who will dominate Asia in the next 5 or 10 years? Communism, the Chinese, or will freedom? The question which we have to decide as Americans, are we doing enough today? Is our strength and prestige rising? Do people want to be identified with us? Do they want to follow the United States leadership? I don't think they do enough, and that's what concerns me. In Africa, these countries that have newly joined the United Nations, on the question of admission of Red China, only 2 countries in all of Africa voted with us, Liberia and the Union of South Africa. The rest either abstained or voted against us. More countries in Asia voted against us on that question than voted with us. I believe that this struggle is going to go on, and it may well be decided in the next decade. I have seen Cuba go to the communists. I have seen communist influence and Castro influence rise in Latin America. I have seen us ignore Africa There are 6 countries in Africa that are members of the United Nations. There isn't a single American diplomatic representative in any of those 6. When Guinea became independent, the Soviet ambassador showed up that very day. We didn't recognize them for 2 months. The American ambassador didn't show up for nearly 8 months. I believe